welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. We live in a rapidly changing world, entangled in a web of ideas and surrounded by many competing interests. In all of this, a sense of uncertainty prevails. Now more than ever, good leadership is needed to inspire and direct. But when we talk about leaders, we often focus on those leading nations and forget about the people who, from classrooms to small businesses, make valuable impact and help communities move forward. On tonight's show, we talk about what it means to be an effective and impactful leader. We also discuss the new age challenges confronting those in leadership positions and how they can deal with these ideas. To explore this topic, we welcome to the show Professor James Trevelyan. He specializes in engineers, develop leadership abilities, and is the author of the book, The Making of an Expert Engineer. He's joining us from Indonesia. We also welcome Ms. Susanne Madsen, who's the project leadership coach and consultant. She's also the author of the book, The Project Management Coaching Workbook, and The Power of Project Leadership. She's joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Susanne, let me begin with you. Now, when we talk about good leaders, there are a few names that pop into our heads. For example, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg. And we often think that these leaders had something inborn within them, something innate. So tell us, can good leaders be made as well, or are they naturally only born to lead?
It's a very good question, and I saw that you had Richard Branson there featuring as well. So you're quite right. We think of these people as being born with certain skills. Leadership is an ongoing journey. We learn throughout our lives, and we definitely should develop our leadership and hone those throughout our lives. So leaders are made. Now, does it mean that some people are born with certain attributes that make them more inclined to be good leaders? I would say yes. So perhaps somebody like Richard Branson, if I may choose him as an example, he may be born being particularly visionary or being particularly well articulate. But that doesn't make somebody a leader necessarily. Think about introverts. Many introverts actually say, oh, I'm not a good leader, I could never lead. But that's not true. Many introverts become the best leaders. But there is something perhaps they need to learn in addition. So I very much like to think of leadership as something we can hone throughout our lives.
Right. And you mentioned here that we can hone this leadership quality throughout our lives. And to that, Professor James, do you think that if the earlier you start, the better? And at what age should leadership qualities start to become fostered and nurtured?
Well, sometimes you see this in the playground with little tiny children. In my work with engineers, what I've noticed is that most of them do have to develop leadership skills, that many of them are not born communicators even. But their first few hours, even days in their first job presents them with the challenge that whatever ideas they come up with as engineers, somebody else has to put that into effect. And so leading other people and getting them to follow you to develop your ideas, and because lots of other people do things with their hands so much better than engineers, but you've got to get them to understand what it is that you want, and that's all about leadership.
Right.
They won't necessarily follow you if they don't respect you as a leader.
Right. And that's a very important thing that you mentioned here, that when you want to get people to follow you, they need to respect you as a leader. And it seems nowadays there's always this tug, and not just nowadays, it's always been this, how to command leadership instead of demanding being in the leading role, how to command respect and authority from the people around you. How do you think that can be done?
Well, it's in the literature, it's called referent power. Power that comes with respect. Partly it's the knowledge that you are presumed to have, but also it's your ability to relate to other people. And that starts with listening to other people, understanding their ideas, and enabling them to realize that they are being respected, being listened to, and that way you command their respect.
Right. And Miss...
That's a key.
Right. And Miss Susanne, on that same point, what do you think are the new age challenges confronting leaders in this fast-paced world? What do you think is something novel that they have to deal with?
I think there's a lot of topics there. Let me just first say that I'm so pleased that James mentioned actually listening to people and relating. That's some of the really big things, because what we really need in leadership is that emotional intelligence piece. And that is one of the things that we need more and more, because the emotional intelligence is really what enables people to connect with those who they are leading. Leading is a voluntary thing. You can't just, demand that people follow you. So also you mentioned earlier on in your introduction that we live in a fast-changing world. There's increasing complexity. People are interconnected. Everything is moving faster. Technological change is moving more rapidly than ever. And so we live in this VUCA world. So this VUCA word is obviously a buzzword that we're using now. Everything is more complex as well. So leaders need to adapt, first of all, in this world. And there are many things that come with that, being able to set the vision. So first of all, where are we going? And the vision is not just set in stone and either demanding that the team follow that vision, because things are interchangeable. And what it means for leaders is we can't rely on one person, a leader, having all the answers. It is not possible anymore because we live in this VUCA world. Right. More than ever before, we need to empower the team, to rely on the team, draw them in, to build the journey together, because together we may have the answers.
Right. And Ms. Susanne, we're going to talk about that in greater depth, but something that you mentioned here while you agreed with Professor James was that a certain degree of emotional intelligence is required in a good leader. Now, I want your opinion on this and Professor James' opinion on this as well. Traditionally, leadership in all sorts of forms has been seen as a masculine role. It requires a sort of aggressiveness. That's why when we would hear about these stereotypical arguments that women can be good leaders, it would always be this thing coming that they're too emotional, they will show too much empathy, and you need an aggressive stance. What's your take on that?
Well, I love the view of leadership being a combination of yin and yang. So the yin is the supportive feminine element and the yang is the challenging masculine element. And we very much need both in order to be effective leaders. So you said before, those masculine men we think of as being the good leaders. But what do? They challenge, they set the standard. They demand that people get to a certain level. Yes, we need that, but we also need the supportive element. This is where the feminine side comes in. So we're helping our team members or whoever we are leading to reach that very challenging level. And this is where the listening comes in, where the empathy comes in. So and we need lots of both. Lots of challenge, how are we going to get better, how are we going to get there, and lots of support. What can I do as a leader to help you achieve that vision? So the combination of the two, I think, is beautiful.
Right. And this combination would be ideal. But do you think, and Professor James, I'd like to ask you this, do you think that most people in management position or leadership positions are realizing this, that both these elements are necessary?
Well, I can't speak for people in management positions, but the position of engineers is really interesting because they have to exert leadership without formal management authority. And that's a real challenge for them. It's a challenge, first of all, for them to accept that they actually need to do this. And particularly in countries like Pakistan, I've noticed that young engineers say, look, I'm just a technical person. Why do I need to learn all this emotional stuff? I should just be allowed to get on with the technical stuff and somebody else should do the management. And what we've seen is that young engineers, a few of them, very few of them, they stumble onto this idea because it's not in the texts. In engineering schools, you never learn about these ideas. But they stumble onto this idea that they do have to work with and influence other people. And once they get that idea, they really take off. And I've been amazed with the performance of some engineers, particularly in countries like Pakistan, where they're producing tremendous value for their organizations because of their leadership skills.
Right. And Professor James, tell us, how do you instill that value within those people who are resistant to the idea? They think that it's not important or it's not needed. How do you make them realize the importance of it?
Gently, particularly with engineers, because they do have many engineers come into the profession with poor people skills, which is reinforced through their courses. But there are many people on the Asperger's syndrome, Asperger's spectrum that end up as engineers. And it's just like something like mathematics. You have to learn to use maths to be an engineer. You also have to learn people skills eventually. And it's a question of encouraging young people to do that and allowing them time to develop these skills, putting them alongside people who have these skills, who can teach them and guide them along the way.
Right. And hold on to that thought, Professor James. We're also joined by Alison Johns, who's the Chief Executive of Advanced HE. She's joining us from London. Thank you so much, Ms. Johns, for joining us, and welcome to the show. While we're talking about leadership and how it's changing in this new age, let's talk about the anxiety that employees and workers are facing. The economy seems to be slowing down, and the IMF predicts that it will continuously do so. And with technological advancement, there's this fear that machines will take over their jobs. So there is a lot of anxiety there. What do good leaders need to do in this day and age to take a hold of that?
Okay, so I think you're absolutely right. The world is changing beyond all measure. And what we see, particularly in higher education, we think about how artificial intelligence will be changing the nature of the work which our students will be moving into in future. But I just heard your previous speaker, I caught the tail end of what they were talking about. Leadership is a very human role that people need to undertake. And what we see particularly here is the notion of the heroic leader who will, be a single leader, lead from the front, and sort of present themselves as a solution to all these problems. That notion is being heavily dismissed nowadays. And I think when there's a lot of anxiety around for people, the best thing we can possibly do is to help them to feel more in control. So that means that leaders, not only do they need to inspire and reassure, have a clear vision, have really excellent people skills, they need to know how to empower individuals to feel more in control and actually bring their skills into solving the solution, finding solutions to the anxieties and the problems they face.
Right, and that's a very, very important and crucial point there. Ms. Susanne, while we're talking about all of this, and as you heard Ms. Allison talk about all of this, how do you think that, and you being a consultant and a coach, how do you think a person can inculcate more of that empathy, that sensitivity, if for all this time they've been very goal-oriented and very driven to achieve, certain standards?
That's another good question you have. I'm actually part of running a leadership program at the moment for project managers in the construction industry. Construction is traditionally very male-dominated. There's very strong contracts. It's a tough environment. And we actually are teaching now or training between 150 and 200 of these very senior project managers in exactly that. How do we do it? Well, we work with actors as well so that they get to play back. How do I do this? How do I come across? So in small groups, we do this. Then they see how a colleague might do that differently. And they learn these very subtle, very important skills of listening, of relating, of pausing. So there are all these interpersonal skills that can be learned with practice. And that's why working with actors is powerful. Working with actors is not the only way. Coaching is important. A coach can be a mirror to the people who want to learn leadership skills. And also feedback. Feedback is so important. When you sit with an actor, you get feedback from the actor and from others, but also feedback from your team. How do I come across? We must be brave enough to ask for feedback. That's one of the main things.
That last phrase there, that you need to be brave enough to ask for feedback. Professor James, how important is it for a person who is leading, is inspiring, to also be receptive to criticism and for to be open to harsh feedback?
Well, of course, it's important, and it can be quite challenging. If you ask me, my quintessential leader is Nelson Mandela, and I was in South Africa last week, and I realized in the high regard that he's held. But to me, his most powerful statement was, as a leader, you're not anybody special. You just happen to be the person that's standing out the front. And people expect you to lead. It's just that you happen to be standing there, and you have to do the best you can.
Right.
And of course, you have to be open to criticism. And it can be quite lonely being out there at times. And one is constantly nervous. We just have to get used to it. So I agree with all of this. But of course, there are lots of people who really struggle with leadership. And many of them, they struggle because they feel nervous, and they think that somehow as a leader you shouldn't feel nervous. That's not the case at all.
Right. And Ms. Johns, while we're talking about all of this, we are seeing a shift in the demographic, especially when it comes to those who are undertaking higher education and those entering the workforce. It's mostly millennials, and it's going to continue being that for quite some time now. Now, it seems like millennials are always forced into this category of being difficult, of having very high expectations. How do you deal with that?
I think millennials just have grown up in a different environment. They have different experiences. And I think it's unfair to say that they're difficult. I think, any good leader, and particularly if you're leading a university or an institution, it's like leading any other business. You need to adapt to your context and your environment. So I think you have to listen to the students who are coming into your institution, understand why they want to do things differently, understand their pressures, their concerns, and fears and anxieties, and work with them. But I think another important point you're making is in the changing demographic as well, is the important changing demographic of who does leadership nowadays.
Right, and how do you do that?
Well, first of all, there are more and more women coming into leadership, and my particular role in higher education in the UK has been very much about advancing gender equality. And we were stuck with about 20 female vice-chancellors for a whole decade. And we did a lot of gender equality programs and initiatives. We now have over 50, and we have a female vice-chancellor of the University of Oxford, which has been around for 1,000 years. That's rather a long time to wait for a female vice-chancellor. But we've got female vice-chancellors of Russell Group institutions, and we have a unique leadership development program for females in higher education, where in the last 5 years, 6,000 women have been through this program, which has not only built their confidence, but it's changing the face of leadership in universities in the UK.
Right. And Ms. Allinson, if you had to point out one leadership quality that is the most important in this changing world, what would it be?
If I had to choose just one, I would say listening, active listening.
Right. Listening to the team and making sure that you're receptive to what they're saying and to get in tune with them. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Alison Johns, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you, Ms. Susanne Madsen, Professor James Trevelyan, for joining us and talking to us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue this discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion regarding leadership, we're now joined by Ms. Lera Boroditsky, who's a cognitive scientist and professor in the fields of language and cognition. She's joining us from California. We're also joined by Mr. Zain Ashraf, who's the founder of Seed Out, which is Pakistan's first crowdfunding platform that works to end poverty. He also helps establish entrepreneurs with interest-free microfinancing. He's joining us from Hong Kong. Thank you both for joining us. Ms. Lera, let me begin with you. Now, in the first half of this show,